Hi, welcome to this demonstration of Kubernetes deployment of a simple web app on localhost. We'll start with the YAML specification files first. We'll begin with secret.yaml. So this is basically the file to store all your secrets that the application will use, like database, user ID and password. As you can see, it's kind of specified as secret, and the name of this file is the Mongo secret. Opaque specifies the secrecy for the user ID and password. The next file here is the config map. This file is basically used, the kind config map is used to configure, in this example, and direct the web traffic from the web app frontend to the service component of the MongoDB service, which is named Mongo service. And we'll talk a little bit more about it when we look at the MongoDB service component. But for now, just try to understand that this is basically used to configure the web traffic to get directed to the MongoDB service component, which will eventually direct the traffic to MongoDB container itself. Then coming to the Mongo backend YAML. So this is a kind of deployment in Kubernetes. The metadata specifies the name of this pod and the label, how you can identify this pod. And the specification also goes on to say that there will be one pod that will run as a replica for the MongoDB service, and each replica will have a matching label of app Mongo, and will use the template also with the label of app Mongo, which is nothing but this metadata service itself. The specification will use the container of the Mongo public image. It'll run on the port 27017, which will be the container port. And for environment variables, it will get the username and password from the secret file, which is nothing but the secret YAML that we discussed before. And it will go inside this file as a reference and will look for Mongo secret, and will get the Mongo user ID and Mongo password from this file. So it'll go in this file and look for Mongo user and Mongo password, and the name of the service on the cluster will be Mongo secret. So again, it'll use this name to locate the service on the cluster, and using this, once it has located the service, it will try to find what are the values specified for Mongo user and Mongo password, and will use that to connect to the database. This is the service component that exposes the MongoDB pod internally to the cluster. As you can see, the kind is service, and on the cluster it will be called Mongo service. It basically talks to the MongoDB container using TCP. It itself runs on 27017 port and targets the MongoDB running on 27017 port, which is this port. So this is the Mongo backend YAML file. Now we'll go to the WebApp YAML file. Pretty much similar to what we saw in Mongo backend YAML file. This is also a kind deployment. It will have its metadata, but here the thing to note is that in the specification there are two replica pods that are running for this web app frontend. Each replica pod is running based on the template with the label app web app, and it's using the container name on the cluster will be web app also. It is using the image of Mongo Express which is a public image, and it's running on 8081. So this is the port for the pod that's running on the node. Now it uses a few environment variables. Like we already discussed about the secret file. So it gets the MongoDB user ID and password from the secret file. Again, using the same methodology, it locates the pod on the cluster, which is Mongo secret, and then it uses this key Mongo user and Mongo password and goes into this file and gets the Mongo user and password to connect to the database. But the important thing to note here is that it also uses the config file. Now it uses the config file, locates this file, goes inside it using the Mongo config, and then tries to find the value of Mongo URL, which is nothing but is the Mongo service, and it points to the service component that's exposing the MongoDB on the internal cluster. This is Mongo service. So kind of web app gets the traffic directed towards the service component of the MongoDB, which then targets it to the actual MongoDB container port. So that's how it works, and that's the use of config here. It will also have its own service component which will expose this web app to the external world, and this time you will see that the type is node port. Note that the service component for MongoDB backend service type was not specified because it got defaulted to cluster IP. So this service was only exposed internally to the cluster. However, this service needs to be exposed externally to the traffic on localhost, so that's why the type is specified as node port, and it's running on 8081. It targets the pod, the port of the pod that's also running on 8081, which is the container running on 8081, and it exposes itself to the external world on port 30100. So that's the specification for the web app itself. Now we will try to deploy all these files one by one and then try to execute the service also. So for deployment, we will use kubectl command. First, we'll see if any deployment exists already or not. So kubectl get deployment. Taking a while. So as you can see, there is no deployment that already exists. We'll also check if any pods are already running or not. So as you can see, there are no pods also running. Now we will try to apply each of these configurations one by one. So we'll say kubectl apply file secret.yaml. So Mongo secret service got created. Now we will apply the config map. Mongo config service got created. Now we'll apply the Mongo backend.yaml. Sorry for the typo. Okay, so Mongo service got created. Let's just clear the screen and let's apply the web app itself, the front end, which is web-app.yaml. Okay, so now after deploying all these, let's try to see if what deployment got created. As you can see, the Mongo deployment is created. There's one pod that's running, and for web app there are two pods that are running. So let's get some more details on the pods. kubectl get pods. Okay, so Mongo deployment pod is running and two pods for web app are running. So now, as I said, this app will expose the itself to port which port 30100. So let's try to access that this web app on this localhost port. Okay, so this web app comes up now on this port, and now you can easily add a database in MongoDB, or add more collections within this database, or basically delete database. So you can basically do all types of administration of the Mongo database. So this was the deployment for the Kubernetes for a simple web application. I will also show you the node that Docker created when I enabled Kubernetes on Docker. So by enabling Kubernetes on Docker, it will automatically create a node cluster for you, where you can use this Kubernetes deployment to spin up multiple pods and use kubectl to as a command line interface to interact with each of them and do the deployment. Thanks for watching this video.